Richard Calloway had not crouched behind a flower pot since he was approximately 7 years old. He was 58 now, worth somewhere north of $400 million depending on the quarter. He had a driver, a security detail, and 3 assistants who managed his calendar with the precision of air traffic controllers. And yet here he was, pressed against a stone planter in the driveway of his own estate, because a 10-year-old boy had grabbed his sleeve and whispered with complete authority, "Don't move! Follow me!" He had followed. He wasn't entirely sure why. The boy, crouching beside him now, one finger pressed to his lips, was named Theo. He was the grandson of Richard's groundskeeper, here for the weekend while his mother traveled for work. Freckled, serious-eyed, wearing a navy sweater 2 sizes too large. The kind of child who observed things quietly and spoke only when he had something worth saying. Across the driveway, Richard's head of security, a large, capable man named Darius, stood beside the car with his back turned, waiting to drive Richard to the airport for a flight that left in 90 minutes. "What exactly," Richard whispered, "are we doing?" Theo held up one finger. "Wait." Richard waited. He had arrived at the estate that morning, in a state he would have described, if pressed, as fine. He was always fine. Fine was the condition he had maintained for 7 years, since his wife Carol had passed, and he had responded the way he responded to every difficult thing, by working harder, moving faster, filling the calendar, until there was no quiet left in which grief could find him. It had been effective. The company had tripled in value. His schedule was immaculate. He felt consistently fine. Theo had been underfoot since Friday. Richard's groundskeeper, a quiet man named George, had apologized twice for his grandson's presence. Richard had said it wasn't a problem, meaning it wasn't something he intended to think about. But Theo had a way of appearing in places unexpectedly. Saturday morning, Richard had found him sitting on the library steps, reading a book about migratory birds with the focused calm of someone doing serious research. Saturday afternoon, Theo had watched Richard take a phone call on the terrace, watched him the way children watch things when they're trying to understand them, and afterward asked, "Do you always look like that when you talk to people?" "Like what?" Richard had said. "Like you're already somewhere else." Richard had not had an answer for that. Sunday evening. Now. Theo had intercepted him in the driveway as he walked to the car with his luggage, heading to another city for another meeting, and grabbed his sleeve with unexpected urgency. "Don't move, follow me." And Richard had crouched behind a stone planter filled with geraniums, while Darius stood 20 feet away, waiting patiently. "Theo," he said quietly, "I have a plane." "I know." The boy wasn't looking at him. He was watching something near the garden gate. "Just wait." "For what?" "You'll see." Richard looked at the garden gate, saw nothing. Looked at Theo, who had the expression of someone who had been waiting for this specific moment, and was not going to rush it. Then he heard it. A sound so ordinary he would have walked past it entirely. A bird, small, brown, completely unremarkable, had landed on the iron gate post and begun to sing. Not a performance. Not the elaborate display of a species trying to attract a mate. Just a small bird at the end of a Sunday evening, singing because that was what it was doing. Theo watched it with complete attention. Richard watched Theo. The bird sang for perhaps 40 seconds. Then it lifted off and disappeared into the palms. Theo looked at Richard. "It comes every Sunday," he said. "Same time, same post. Grandpa showed me." Richard looked at the gatepost where the bird had been. "Your grandfather noticed that?" "He notices everything that happens in this garden." Theo said it without judgment, just information. "He's been working here for 12 years. He knows every plant, every bird that visits, which flowers open first in the morning." A pause. "He says you've never asked him about any of it." Richard was quiet. "He's not upset about it," Theo added carefully. "He just said it. I asked him what you were like, and that's what he said. That you walk through the garden, but you don't really see it." The driveway was very still in the evening light. Palm trees catching the last of the sun. The gate posts throwing long shadows across the stone. "You pulled me behind a flower pot," Richard said finally. to show me a bird. I pulled you behind a flower pot so you'd have to stop." Theo looked at him with that direct, undecorated gaze. "You were going to walk right past it. You walk past everything." Richard had no answer for that either. Darius had turned around and was now observing his employer crouched in the garden with a 10-year-old, with the professional neutrality of a man who had learned not to have visible opinions about things. Richard stood slowly, brushed off his jacket. He looked at the garden, really looked at it, the way he apparently had not been doing for 12 years. The colors in the evening light, the way the palms moved, the stone planters his wife had chosen, he suddenly remembered, from a trip they had taken before the company became what it became, before the calendar filled up, before there was no quiet left. Carol had loved this garden. He had paid for it to be maintained beautifully for 7 years and had not once stood in it long enough to hear a bird sing. He sat back down next to Theo on the edge of the planter. Darius looked at his watch, said nothing. "Tell me about the garden," Richard said. Theo looked at him to confirm he was serious. Then he began. He talked about the geraniums and which ones had bloomed latest this year and why George thought the soil pH was off. He talked about the bird, a white-throated sparrow apparently, winter visitor, arrived every October and left in April. He talked about the way the evening light hit the gate at this exact time of year, this exact hour, and turned the stone a color that Theo said he couldn't describe, but that his grandfather called gold that knows it's leaving. Richard listened. Not the way he listened on phone calls already somewhere else. Actually listened. The plane was missed. Not dramatically. Richard simply called his assistant from the driveway and said to rebook for morning. His assistant, who had worked for him for 9 years and had never once heard him miss a flight voluntarily, asked if everything was all right. "Fine," he said. Then, "Actually, yes, everything's fine." He had George join them after that. The three of them walked the garden in the last of the light while George named things and explained things and talked about the 12 years he had spent learning the particular character of this piece of land. And Richard listened with the specific attention of a man who had been handed something he hadn't known he was missing. Before Theo went inside for the evening, he stopped at the door and looked back at Richard. "Same time next Sunday," he said. "The bird." Richard looked at the gatepost. "I'll be here," he said. Theo nodded, satisfied, and went inside. George stayed for a moment after his grandson left, and Richard looked at him directly for probably the first time in 12 years of good morning, and the garden looks well. "I owe you a conversation," Richard said. "Several, probably." George smiled the smile of a man who has been patient a long time and doesn't need the apology, but accepts it. "The garden will still be here," he said. "It always is." Richard did not become a different man overnight. The company still ran. The calendar still filled, the flights still left. But something had shifted, some small, important thing. In the space between a stone planter and an iron gatepost, in 40 seconds of a small bird singing at the end of a Sunday evening. He started walking through the garden with his eyes open. He learned the names of things. He asked George questions and listened to the answers. And every Sunday evening at the same hour, he stood at the gate and waited for a small brown bird that his groundskeeper's grandson had thought important enough to stop the world for. It was, he came to understand, the most useful thing anyone had done for him in years. All it had taken was a 10-year-old grabbing his sleeve and saying, "Don't move, follow me," and a man finally deciding to stop walking past things. The end.